My name is Clara Montgomery. Before you do anything else, I want you to take a second, grab a cup of coffee or tea, and just sit down with me. We need to have a real quiet conversation about something most people are too proud or too hurt to ever talk about out loud. If you have ever been the person in your family who was quietly assigned the role of the fixer, sir, the one who carries the weight, coordinates the crises, and keeps the engine running while someone else gets the applause, then I want you to type the word boundaries in the comments right now. Seriously, let's create a space down there where we don't have to pretend anymore. Because for 26 years, I was the daughter who stayed small so my family could feel big. I was the useful one, never the wanted one. And if you know what that distinction feels like deep in your bones, you know it's a slow, aching kind of isolation. Right now, hanging in the front closet of my new apartment in New Haven, there is a navy wool professional suit jacket. If you looked at it from across the room, the first thing you would notice isn't the tailoring or the classic cut. You would notice the massive, aggressive, chaotic streaks of harsh orange and faded yellow running violently down the entire right lapel and pooling across the front pockets. It looks like a mistake. It looks like something that should have been thrown into a dumpster years ago. But to me, that jacket is a trophy. It is a physical receipt of the exact moment my family tried to completely erase my future, and the moment I decided to stop holding up the walls of their beautifully curated house. Let's go back to the night it all fractured. It was a freezing Saturday evening in February, less than 36 hours before the most crucial day of my life, my admissions interview with the board at Yale School of Medicine. I had spent 4 grueling years working 2 retail jobs, drowning in textbooks, and taking on thousands of dollars of independent student debt just to buy that single pristine navy suit. It was my armor. I had left it draped neatly over the ironing board in the laundry room, just off the kitchen, stepping away for less than a minute to fill a spray bottle with water at the sink. When I turned back around, the sharp, choking smell of pure chemical chlorine hit the back of my throat. My younger sister, Vanessa, was standing over the ironing board. She was holding an industrial-sized gallon of Clorox bleach, tipped entirely upside down. She wasn't rushing. She was doing it with a slow, deliberate precision, watching the clear liquid hit the navy wool, listening to it hiss and sizzle against the hot metal of the iron. And the most terrifying part? She was looking directly at me, her face completely blank, wearing a tiny, vacant smile. I stood there frozen, the plastic spray bottle slipping from my fingers and clattering into the sink. The bleach bloomed instantly, eating through the fabric, turning the proud professional navy into a corroded, ruined mess of raw orange chemical burns. From the adjacent family room, the television was ambiently playing. My mother, Eleanor, didn't even look up from her iPad screen where she was scrolling through a charity gala guest list. Her voice was flat, dry, and utterly devoid of warmth as she said, "Stop making a scene, Clara. It's just a jacket. You're always so incredibly dramatic." Before I could even find my breath to speak, my father's voice drifted in from the couch, laced with the casual dismissal he had practiced for 2 decades. "Your sister is going through enough right now with her own transitions, Clara. Don't ruin her weekend. Just go upstairs." In that exact room, surrounded by the expensive crown molding and the scent of chemical sabotage, I realized something that changed the chemistry of my brain forever. They didn't ruin my suit because they were clumsy, and Vanessa didn't do it because she was manic. They did it because they were terrified of what would happen if I finally stepped out of the shadow they built for me. To understand why a 23-year-old woman would smile while pouring chemical corrosive down the front of her sister's only interview suit, You have to understand the architecture of the Montgomery household. We grew up in a sprawling, pristine five-bedroom colonial in Wellesley, Massachusetts. My father, Richard Montgomery, was a senior partner at a legacy wealth management firm in Boston. My mother, Eleanor, was a professional pillar of the community. She sat on the board of two prominent regional museums and directed the fundraising committee for the symphony. From the outside, our lives looked like a perfectly staged catalog. We were the family the local lifestyle magazines photographed in the spring, standing in front of our perfectly manicured hydrangeas. But inside those walls, the air was thin, and the rules were entirely transactional. I was the firstborn. Vanessa came exactly 3 years later, and from the very week she was brought home from the hospital, the narrative was established. My mother didn't just love Vanessa. She projected an idealized, flawless version of herself onto her. Vanessa had what my mother called the right kind of presence. She had the soft, golden curls, the effortlessly compliant laugh, and the delicate features that people naturally wanted to accommodate. I, on the other hand, was dark-haired, quiet, intense, and chronically observant. My mother used to tell her friends at luncheons, "Clara is our sturdy one. She's built for the background. But Vanessa is our star." That dynamic wasn't just a passive preference. It was an active daily sorting mechanism. I remember a piano recital when I was 11 years old. I had practiced a complex Chopin nocturne for 4 months straight, until my fingertips were calloused and my wrists ached. I went up on that stage, terrified, and played the entire piece flawlessly, without missing a single expression mark. When I walked off the stage, my heart hammering against my ribs, my mother gave me a brief, polite pat on the shoulder. "You did very well, Clara," she murmured, her eyes already scanning the crowded lobby. "But remember, Vanessa is the one with the natural stage presence. Let's make sure we don't monopolize the conversation tonight. Your sister has her dance showcase next week, and she needs to feel supported." Vanessa hadn't touched a piano in over a year. Yet somehow, my hard work was turned into an inheritance for her ego. That was the tax of being the older sister in our house. If I succeeded, it was treated as my basic duty. If Vanessa barely participated, it was celebrated as a stroke of sheer genius. By the time I reached my late teens, the roles were permanently cemented. I was the useful child. If the caterers miscalculated the guest count for one of my mother's charity dinners, I was the one pulled out of bed to quietly prep hors d'oeuvres in the kitchen, so the staff wouldn't look bad. If my father needed his dense corporate presentation slides proofread and formatted over a holiday weekend, it was dropped onto my desk without a "please" or a "thank you." I became the invisible infrastructure of their perfect life. I was the one who kept the household running smoothly, while Vanessa was the luxury item they displayed to the world. Have you ever noticed how people treat the things that are useful versus the things that are wanted? You protect what you want. You use what is useful until it wears out, and then you replace it without a second thought. That was my currency. I allowed myself to be used because I genuinely believed that if I became entirely indispensable, they would eventually have no choice but to love me. When I turned 16, I sat at our long mahogany dinner table and said out loud for the very first time that I wanted to go to medical school and become a pediatric oncologist. I had been volunteering at a local free clinic in a marginalized neighborhood outside Boston, and I had seen the massive gap in bilingual patient advocacy. I wanted to be in the trenches of medicine. My father didn't even pause his chewing. He set his heavy silver fork down with a dull clink, while my mother smiled at me with that patronizing, syrupy sweetness you usually reserve for a toddler who just announced they are going to build a rocket ship out of cardboard. The very next week, we attended a gala for the Boston Children's Hospital donors. Standing by the champagne fountain, I hid behind a pillar and overheard my mother chatting with a prominent trustee. "Oh, yes," Eleanor laughed, gently waving her diamond-encrusted hand. "Our Vanessa has just decided she wants to be a pediatrician. She has always had this magnificent, almost spiritual connection with children. We're already looking into early preparation tracks for her." Vanessa was 13 at the time. She wasn't even in the room. She was home, likely on her computer, entirely indifferent to medicine. My mother had taken my dream, stripped my name off it, and neatly pasted it onto her favorite daughter like a new designer accessory. A few days later, my father walked into my bedroom. He didn't knock. He sat on the edge of my mattress, adjusted his cuffs, and looked at me with what he genuinely believed was profound paternal kindness. "Clara," he said, his voice smooth and measured, "medicine is an incredibly long, exhausting road. It requires a specific kind of public-facing temperament, a certain social grace to secure placements and manage patient politics. Vanessa has that gift. You are far better suited for behind-the-scenes support roles. That's not an insult, sweetheart. It's just an objective observation. We have to be strategic about where we invest our family resources." That was the moment the blueprint became entirely clear. They had decided which daughter would be the doctor and which daughter would be the shadow. They just hadn't bothered to check if the daughter they chose actually had a brain for it. When it came time for college, I didn't ask for their help. I applied to Tufts University entirely on my own. I drafted my essays late at night under the glow of a desk lamp, hiding the documents in a secure folder. When the acceptance letter arrived, I told them in the kitchen while my mother was arranging flowers. "Tufts is fine, Clara," she murmured without snipping a single stem. "It's not an Ivy, so it's not really a school we can brag about at the country club, but it's fine for what you need." My father added, "Just don't expect us to bankroll a medical degree after this. Vanessa's private education and her future consulting fees are what we've been aggressively saving for." I started my undergraduate degree in September of 2017. I took on maximum student loans. I worked 2 jobs. One as a library assistant and another pulling overnight shifts at a diner. For 4 years, I did not invite my parents to a single campus event, a single parent weekend, or a single awards ceremony. In May of 2021, I graduated with highest honors in molecular biology. My parents didn't attend the ceremony. They claimed Vanessa had a crucial tennis tournament that weekend that they simply couldn't miss. Instead of crying, I packed my entire life into a battered sedan, drove to a tiny, drafty one-bedroom apartment in Brighton, and signed a lease for $1,850 a month. 3 weeks later, I started working as a patient navigator with the Joint Pediatric Oncology Program at Dana-Farber. My salary was a meager $58,000 a year, but my real wealth was the access to the clinical space. Meanwhile, my mother was managing Vanessa's path like a high-stakes corporate merger. When Vanessa entered Wellesley College, my parents hired a private MCAT tutor out of Cambridge for a staggering $12,500. They paid an admissions consultant a fortune to polish her resume. They used my father's corporate donor connections to arrange elite shadowing opportunities at Boston Children's Hospital. My mother would boast at dinner parties as about how Vanessa was practically running the pediatric floors. But because I worked in that exact system, I eventually pulled the security visitor badge logs out of sheer curiosity. Vanessa had been on that oncology floor exactly 4 times in 3 years. Her total cumulative time logged was 5 hours and 22 minutes. Most of that time was spent taking photos in her white coat for her social media profile. By contrast, I had quietly logged over 3,200 hours of grueling, hands-on clinical navigation with dying children and terrified families. I was the one translating complex oncology protocols into Spanish for immigrant mothers. I was the one sitting awake at 3 a.m. holding the hands of toddlers while the chemo dripped into their ports. But in our family home, only one of those numbers mattered. And it wasn't the one belonging to the daughter who actually did the work. That Saturday night, as the heavy chemical fumes of the Clorox bleach filled the small laundry room, I didn't yell. I didn't scream at Vanessa. I didn't grab the bottle from her hands. And I didn't throw the hot iron across the room. I just stood there, watching the aggressive orange chemical stain expand like a cancer across the navy wool fabric of my only professional suit. Vanessa took a slow step backward, her small, empty smile still perfectly intact. She casually set the nearly empty plastic jug down on the edge of the washing machine, wiped her hands on her designer jeans, and strolled back into the family room as if she had done nothing more than pour a glass of water. From the couch, my mother's fingers didn't even pause their rhythmic tapping on her iPad screen. "Stop making a scene, Clara," she repeated, her tone dripping with an icy, practiced boredom. "It's just a jacket. You're always so incredibly dramatic. Honestly, this constant need of yours to be the center of attention is exhausting." My father adjusted his reading glasses, took a slow sip of his Cabernet, and nodded in agreement. "Your sister is under an immense amount of pressure with her current clinical rotations at Yale, Clara. She's going through enough without you fabricating a crisis over a piece of clothing. Don't ruin this family dinner for her. Just go upstairs and deal with it." I looked at the two of them. Then I looked at Vanessa, who was now curled up on the armchair, text messaging someone on her phone with absolute, unbothered calm. And in that exact moment, a profound, chilling clarity washed over me. For years, I had built a library of scenarios in my head about what I would do if my family ever crossed a final, unforgivable line. I had imagined slamming doors, crying, shouting the truth of their cruelty until their expensive crown moldings shook. What I had never imagined, what no one tells you about the moment you finally wake up, is that when the line is actually crossed, the anger disappears. It replaces itself with a cold, brilliant, immovable stillness. I didn't argue, I didn't say a single word. I simply reached out, clicked the power switch on the iron to off, unplugged the cord from the wall, and folded the ruined, chemically burning blazer over my forearm. I walked out of the kitchen, past the couch where my parents sat wrapped in their wealthy illusions, and climbed the stairs to my old bedroom. I sat on the edge of my mattress in the dark for exactly 40 minutes, holding the damp, warm fabric in my lap. The harsh scent of chlorine filled the small room. The orange discoloration was already setting into the wool, permanently destroying the fibers. I knew from my years handling aggressive hospital-grade disinfectants at the clinic that there was no saving it. The suit was dead. But as I sat there in the dark, staring at the stain, I noticed something I'd been too blind to see before. Vanessa hadn't ruined my jacket because she was careless or malicious in a random way. She had done it because she was fundamentally, deeply terrified. She was currently an M1 student at Yale School of Medicine, a seat my parents had essentially bought, polished, and stolen material to secure for her. And on Monday morning, I was scheduled to sit across from that exact same admissions board for my own interview. Vanessa knew, my mother knew, and my father knew that if I walked into that building with my actual credentials, my actual clinical hours, and my actual mind, the flimsy, expensive house of cards they had built for the golden child would collapse. The bleach wasn't an act of malice. It was an act of desperation. They needed me to look broken. They needed me to fail so they could keep believing their own lies. And as that realization settled into my chest, I felt a quiet, dangerous smile touch my own lips. They thought they had ruined my armor. They had no idea they had just stripped away the only thing holding me back. I didn't sleep that night, while the rest of the house fell into a comfortable, wealthy slumber. At 11 p.m., I sat at the small, built-in desk in my old bedroom with my laptop open, the screen brightness turned down to the absolute lowest setting. The pungent, sharp scent of the bleached blazer draped over the back of my chair acted like adrenaline in my veins. They thought they had stripped me of my dignity. What they had actually done was free up my calendar. I was no longer trying to figure out how to navigate a polite family breakfast the next morning. I was no longer trying to preserve their feelings. For the last 3 years, under the guise of helping with the family estate taxes and corporate administrative filings, my father had routinely passed dense legal and financial documents to me to review, summarize, and format. Because I was the useful child who majored in biology and possessed a sharp analytical mind for data, he trusted me to look over the fine print that he and my mother were too busy to thoroughly parse. One evening when I was 18, I remember sitting at the dining table while my father slid a heavy stack of legal disclosures across the wood. "Just look through these and sign where the sticky notes are, Clara," he had murmured, barely looking up from his newspaper. "It's just standard asset restructuring for the family trust. It helps keep your sister's educational funds protected." At 18, I had signed those papers blindly, assuming it was just another chore to help my sister. But sitting under the glow of my laptop screen at 2:00 a.m., 6 years later, I logged into the secure, encrypted legal portal where all our family trust documents were archived. I began downloading every single page of those old restructurings, reading the dense legal jargon with a fully trained, hyper-focused adult mind. And that's when I found the first major structural flaw in my parents' grand design. To shelter their primary residential asset, the massive, 5-bedroom colonial house in Wellesley we were currently sleeping from specific corporate liabilities and high-exposure management lawsuits, my father's legal team had moved the deed of the property into a separate LLC. To minimize the tax burden upon their eventual retirement, they had structured that LLC as a split-interest multi-generational trust. Because Vanessa was younger and had a lighter credit profile at the time, and because they wanted to tie the asset to the first child who reached legal independence to secure a specific municipal tax exemption, my father had listed me as the primary managing beneficiary of the holding company. He had forgotten. He had signed the paperwork years ago, filed it away in a digital vault, and completely forgotten that the invisible background daughter was technically the sole legal owner of the dirt they stood on and the roof over their heads. I didn't stop there. I opened a fresh, encrypted spreadsheet and began building what I call the mastermind's ledger. Column by column, I organized the data. I pulled the master version history of the family's shared Google Drive. I screenshotted the metadata showing that on May 14th, 2024, at 2:28 in the morning, an account matching my mother's IP address had accessed my private folder, opened my personal statement draft about my clinical research, and spent exactly 42 minutes viewing it. I matched that metadata timestamp with a text thread my father had accidentally forwarded to me months prior regarding a separate logistics issue. The tasked thread that still contained an uncleared history showing my mother telling him, "Vanessa's essay is fixed." I found the narrative hook we needed. Next, I logged into the internal hospital volunteer database at Dana-Farber using my professional coordinator credentials. I exported the certified, time-stamped clinical logs of my 3,200 hours of bilingual patient navigation alongside the electronic security logs showing Vanessa's nominal 4 visits. I didn't print anything. I didn't make a sound. I saved every single file into a triple encrypted, cloud-backed folder, and then I scheduled an automated email containing the entire ledger to be delivered to my private attorney on Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. By the time the first faint, pale gray light of Monday morning began to bleed through the window blinds, my ledger was complete. I closed my laptop, slid it into my leather briefcase, and stood up. I put on a crisp white silk blouse, tailored trousers, and then, with absolute deliberation, I slipped my arms into the ruined, bleach-stained navy blazer. The front of the jacket was a grotesque, mottled landscape of chemically burned orange and yellow rings against the pristine navy wool. It smelled faintly of laundry room warfare. I looked at myself in the mirror, pulled my hair back into a sleek, tight bun, and picked up my car keys. They wanted me to go to New Haven looking like a victim. I was going there looking like an executioner. I drove the 135 miles from Wellesley to New Haven in a state of absolute unbothered silence. The winter sun came up over my left shoulder somewhere outside Wallingford, throwing a sharp, bright glare across the highway. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't look at the text messages flashing on my dashboard from my mother, which I already knew would be a mixture of superficial checking in and subtle, emotional management. I just watched the road, feeling the stiff, chemically altered wool of the bleached blazer scraping slightly against my wrists every time I turned the steering wheel. I parked at the Sterling Hall of Medicine at precisely 7:58 a.m. When I walked through the heavy glass doors of the admissions office, the temperature inside was warm, smelling faintly of old wood and high-end floor wax. The reception area was pristine. There were 7 other applicants sitting in the leather armchairs, every single wearing immaculate, perfectly tailored black or charcoal suits without a single crease. When I stepped up to the front desk, the admissions assistant looked up from her computer monitor. Her eyes immediately dropped to my jacket. I could see the subtle, polite panic flash across her face as she took in the massive, violently orange and yellow chemical burns running down the entire right side of my chest. "Clara Montgomery," I said, my voice dropping into that low, completely steady register I had practiced during hundreds of late-night clinical shifts. The assistant cleared her throat, her fingers tapping the keyboard quickly. "Yes, Miss Montgomery. You have 3 interview slots today. Your first is at 10 a.m. with Dr. Linwood. Your second is at 11:15 a.m. with the Dean of Admissions, Dr. Hudson Marlowe, and your third is at 1:30 p.m. with Dr. Larkin." She paused, looking back up at me, her eyes lingering on the bleach stain. "I should note, Dr. Marlowe's office flagged your file this morning. He requested this specific slot for you himself. That doesn't happen often." "Thank you," I murmured. I spent the next hour in the first interview with Dr. Phoebe Linwood. She was professional, observant, and thorough. She asked deep, structural questions about my 3,200 hours of bilingual patient navigation at Dana-Farber. She made a small, sharp sound of surprise when she verified the volume of my clinical data. Most of our traditional applicants have under 800 hours of passive shadowing. "Miss Montgomery," she said, her eyes shifting for the first time to the orange ruin on my lapel. "You have essentially been operating as a full-time clinical anchor for these families. That is extraordinary." She didn't ask about the jacket, and I didn't offer an explanation. I knew the stage wasn't fully set yet. At 11:15 a.m., I knocked on the heavy oak door of office 204. "Come in," a calm, resonant voice called out. Dr. Hudson Marlowe's office was lined with dark wood shelving, crowded with dense medical volumes, framed international pediatric honors, and black and white photographs of early clinical research labs. He was a man in his early 60s, with thick silver hair, sharp, intelligent eyes, and an overall demeanor that felt entirely unhurried. He stood up to shake my hand, and as he did, his gaze locked instantly onto my bleached blazer. He didn't look disgusted. He looked intensely curious. He motioned for me to sit in the green leather chair opposite his mahogany desk, where a single, closed manila folder lay beside his open laptop. "Miss Montgomery," Dr. Marlowe began, leaning back and folding his hands over his knee. "I've read your submitted application 3 times now. But before we discuss your methodology or your academic metrics, I want to ask you a very specific question. Tell me about a patient who completely redefined how you view the ethical responsibility of medicine." I didn't use any of the rehearsed, polished answers my parents had spent years telling me I would need to impress an Ivy League board. I looked directly into his eyes and told him about Mateo. I told him about an 8-year-old boy who had been diagnosed with an aggressive, high-risk neuroblastoma. I told him about his mother, Elena, who spoke no English and worked 12-hour shifts cleaning operating rooms, and how the clinical teams would accidentally speak too fast, leaving Elena crying in the corridor because she thought the word induction meant her son was being sent home to die. I told him how I had sat on the edge of Mateo's bed, switched to fluent Spanish, and broken down the cellular biology of the treatment into a story about tiny soldiers defending a castle. I told him about how I spent 2.5 years reading Mateo classic literature in the infusion suite, and how, on a rainy Tuesday in April of 2024, Mateo had looked out the window facing the eastern courtyard and said, "Clara, look, the sun still found a way through the clouds today. I'm still here." I spoke for exactly 6 minutes. Dr. Marlowe did not interrupt me once. His face remained completely unreadable, but his eyes never left mine. When I finished, the silence in the room was absolute. Dr. Marlowe didn't say thank you. He didn't nod. He slowly reached forward, opened the middle drawer of his desk, and pulled out a folded piece of heavy, hospital-grade sketch paper. He unfolded it with meticulous care and turned it around so it faced me. It was a pencil drawing. It showed a small, thin boy in a hospital bed, holding the hand of a woman with her hair pulled back into a tight bun, wearing scrubs and a patient navigator badge. On the back, written in the shaky, unpracticed handwriting of an 8-year-old child, were 5 words. "For when you graduate. Mateo." My chest tightened, the room suddenly feeling incredibly small. "Where did you get that?" I whispered. Dr. Marlowe leaned forward, his voice dropping into a low, incredibly serious tone. "This drawing was forwarded to my personal office 14 months ago by Dr. Beatrice Nell, the attending chief of pediatric oncology at Boston Children's. She sent it with a letter written by Elena, Mateo's mother, before they moved back to her home country. The letter simply said, 'Please make sure the people who choose the doctors know what Clara Montgomery did for my son.'" He stopped, his eyes moving slowly from the drawing to my last name on his screen, and finally to the massive, chemically burned orange stain on my navy blazer. "Wait, you're her?" he said, his voice laced with absolute disbelief. "You are the Clara Montgomery who actually logged those 3,000 hours?" "Yes," I said, my voice unwavering. Dr. Marlowe tapped his laptop screen. "Miss Montgomery, we have a catastrophic problem in our admissions system. Because 8 months ago, an M1 student named Vanessa Montgomery matriculated into this medical school. And the core narrative of her application essay, the exact description of Mateo's window facing east, the exact Spanish phrasing used during the induction explanation, the exact quote about the sun, Finding a Way Through the Clouds was submitted under her name. The admissions committee sat in this very room and wept over those words. We gave her a full merit scholarship based on that story. He let the words hang in the air between us. The bleach on my jacket suddenly felt hot against my skin. I have been waiting 14 months to meet the person who actually wrote those words, Clara, Dr. Marlowe said, his eyes turning cold as steel. And now I see you sitting in front of me, wearing a suit that looks like someone tried to chemically burn the evidence off your back before you could step into this building. If you have ever had to walk back into a room full of people who think they've successfully ruined you, knowing that you hold the exact key to their complete systemic destruction, type the word stereotology in the comments right now. Because there is an incredible, almost intoxicating power in staying completely calm when your enemies think you're down for the count. I finished my final interview with Dr. Larkin at 2:30 p.m. He, too, looked at my bleached jacket with a mixture of confusion and professional restraint. But by that point, the entire machinery of the Yale School of Medicine admissions office was silently pivoting behind the scenes. I didn't say a word to the other applicants. I walked back out to my car, placed my leather briefcase on the passenger seat, and drove back toward Massachusetts at a completely legal, unhurried pace. When I pulled into the brick driveway of the Wellesley Colonial at 6:30 p.m., the house was glowing with warm, expensive light. Through the massive bay windows of the dining room, I could see my family already gathered around the mahogany table. My father had opened a high-end bottle of wine. My mother was laughing at something Vanessa was saying. They looked like a picture-perfect portrait of generational success. They thought I was coming home broken, weeping, and eliminated from the board. I walked through the front door, leaving my coat in the hall, but keeping the bleach-stained jacket firmly on my shoulders. As I entered the dining room, the laughter died instantly. Vanessa's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Her eyes went wide as she saw the orange and yellow chemical rings still proudly decorating my chest. My mother's smile hardened into a tight, defensive line, while my father slowly set his wine glass down, his face flushing a deep, uncomfortable crimson. "Clara," Eleanor said, her voice dropping that cheerful facade she used for the public. "What on earth are you doing? Why are you still wearing that hideous thing?" "We told you to handle that privately. You look absolutely unhinged." "I wore it to my interview," I said, my voice dangerously calm as I stood at the foot of the table looking down at the three of them. Vanessa let out a sharp, nervous scoff. "You actually went into Yale looking like a charity case? God, Clara, you really are pathetic. You probably humiliated the family name before you even opened your mouth." "Actually, Vanessa," I murmured, sliding my leather briefcase onto the edge of the table and unclicking the brass latches with a loud, deliberate snap. The interview went perfectly. In fact, Dr. Hudson Marlowe spent quite a bit of time reviewing my file. And yours. I pulled out 3 neatly organized, stapled packets from my briefcase. The physical printouts of the mastermind's ledger I had compiled the night before. I slid one packet to my mother, one to my father, and the final one directly in front of Vanessa. "What is this nonsense?" my father barked, reaching for the paper with an aggressive swipe of his hand. "That is the metadata trail from the family Google Drive," I explained, pointing to the top page of my mother's packet. Showing the exact date and time, Eleanor accessed my private personal statement draft about Matteo and copied my clinical prose word for word into Vanessa's Ivy League application. Next to it, you'll find the security visitor badge logs from Boston Children's Hospital, documenting that Vanessa has spent a grand total of 5 hours on the pediatric floor in 3 years, compared to my 3,000 certified clinical hours. Vanessa's face went entirely white, the paper trembling in her hands. Mom, what is this? What did she do? Quiet, Vanessa, Eleanor snapped, her analytical mind finally catching up to the danger. She looked up at me, her eyes narrowing into slits. You think a university board is going to listen to a disgruntled, bitter sister over our family's long-standing donor reputation? We have built this community, Clara. We fund their programs. Your little spreadsheet means absolutely nothing. It means everything to the Yale Committee on Honor and Professionalism, which opened a formal academic misrepresentation file against Vanessa at exactly 1 p.m. today, I replied, leaning forward slightly, resting my hands flat on the mahogany wood. My father stood up so fast his chair screeched against the hardwood floor. Clara, you will drop this immediately. You are destroying your sister's career before it even begins. We are your parents. We can cut you off completely. We will strip you of every corporate resource, every dime of family backing. You can't cut me off from what I already legally control, Dad, I said, flipping to the second tab of his packet. Do you remember the multi-generational split interest trust you set up 6 years ago to shelter this house from your firm's liability management lawsuits? You listed your useful daughter as the sole primary managing beneficiary to secure the municipal tax exemption. You signed the management rights over to me. At 8:14 in the morning, the room became so completely quiet that you could hear the structural ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. My father's mouth opened slightly, his eyes scanning the dense legal disclosures he had entirely forgotten about. As the legal managing entity of the holding company, I continued, my voice entirely flat, I have already instructed my attorney to initiate an immediate asset reclamation. You have exactly 30 days to vacate this property or restructure your entire corporate portfolio to buy it back from me at full market value. I am not asking you to understand. I am telling you what is happening. Eleanor looked at her husband, waiting for him to contradict me, to find a legal loophole, to yell. But as Richard Montgomery slowly sank back down into his leather chair, staring blankly at the signature pages bearing his own handwriting, she realized the truth. The shadow daughter hadn't just stepped out of the background. She had systematically bought the ground they were standing on while they were busy celebrating a stolen crown. If you have ever had to pack your entire life into a few cardboard boxes, leave behind the keys to a house that never truly felt like a home, and drive away into a completely unknown morning, type the word liberation in the comments right now. Because let me tell you, there is no sound on this earth more beautiful than the quiet hum of your own car engine taking you toward a life you chose entirely for yourself. I didn't stay to watch the structural fallout of that dinner. I didn't stay to listen to my mother's frantic phone calls to corporate lawyers, or my sister Vanessa's desperate, tear-streaked apologies that she only thought to offer once the trap had already sprung. I went upstairs, packed my laptop, my legal files, and a single suitcase of clothes. I took the ruined navy blazer off my shoulders, folded it neatly into a garment bag, and walked out of the Wellesley Colonial for the last time. 3 weeks later, on April 22, 2026, the Yale Committee on Honor and Professionalism delivered its official binding decision. Vanessa Montgomery was formally dismissed from the Yale School of Medicine, effective immediately, for egregious academic misrepresentation and intentional authorship fraud in her admissions materials. Her merit scholarship was revoked, and the transcript of the hearing was permanently flagged dead in the National Medical Residency Clearinghouse database, ensuring she would never be able to sneak her way into another clinical program in this country. The systematic unraveling of my parents' carefully curated universe didn't stop there. Facing the immediate high-exposure reality of an asset reclamation lawsuit over their primary residence, my father was forced to liquidate a massive portion of his legacy hedge fund shares to pay off the multi-generational trust liabilities. The financial stress broke what was left of their transactional marriage. My father called me from a temporary corporate rental in Boston's Back Bay, his voice sounding older, thinner, and completely stripped of that arrogant, patronizing edge he had carried for 30 years. "I'm separating from your mother, Clara," he told me, the phone line static heavy. "I'm not asking you to forgive me for the ways we used your mind to build our illusions. I'm just asking for time to do the next part of my life right. I'd like to see you when you're ready." "I'll let you know when I'm ready, Dad," I said quietly, and then I hung up. I didn't block his number, but I left the call sitting in the history log without a follow-up. True healing doesn't require you to rush back into the burning building just because the people who set the fire finally realize they're getting burned, too. I moved into a small, sunlit, third-floor apartment in New Haven in early August. It doesn't have custom crown moldings, and it doesn't look like the pages of a luxury design catalog. But the windows face east, and every single morning I get to sit at a small wooden table with a fresh cup of coffee and watch the sunrise bleed orange and gold across the city skyline. Hanging on a wooden peg right next to my front door is that navy wool suit jacket. The aggressive, chemically burned orange rings are still there, running violently down the lapel. A permanent scar from a night intended to destroy me. But last week, I took that jacket to a small, independent tailor shop run by an elderly immigrant woman who reminded me so much of Mateo's mother, Elena. Together, we spent an afternoon working in absolute silence. Using a spool of heavy, pristine white silk embroidery thread, we opened up the delicate inner lining of the blazer, right over the left breast where the fabric sits directly against the human heart. With slow, meticulous, beautiful stitches, we embroidered a single elegant letter, M. Now, when I put that jacket on, the outside world still sees the chaotic, mottled landscape of a family's desperate sabotage. They see the mess. But on the inside, hidden entirely against my skin, where no one can ever touch it or take it away from me again, is the name of the child who reminded me why I wanted to heal people in the first place. My mother always told me it was just a jacket. She was wrong about that. She was wrong about almost everything. The story she tried to construct for our family was, in the end, just a flimsy piece of fiction built on stolen labor and expensive branding. The story Mateo wrote with a pencil on a piece of hospital sketch paper. The one about the light, always finding a way through the darkest clouds. That was the one that turned out to be entirely beautifully true. I start my first official day of classes at the Yale School of Medicine in exactly 3 weeks. I will walk through those historic stone archways into a world my sister had to leave behind, and I will do it with a child's drawing on my shelf, a brilliant medical mind in my head, and a legacy of pure, unbothered integrity sewn directly into the fabric of my soul. Thank you for sitting with me today. Choose yourself, set your boundaries, and never let anyone who is afraid of your light tell you how small you're allowed to be.